He waited, and waited, for nearly 4 decades. When Carey Dean Moore was finally strapped to the gurney in 2018, the prison guard standing nearby had long since retired. Some of the reporters covering his execution weren't even born when he was sentenced to die. For 38 years, he lived under the flickering lights of death row in Nebraska, his days measured by routine, appeals, and the slow erosion of time. Longer than many lifetimes. Long enough for the world to change beyond recognition. And yet, for him, nothing changed at all. Why was he kept alive for so long? Was it mercy? Or was it the ultimate cruelty to wake up every single day for nearly 4 decades, knowing exactly how it would end? Carey Dean Moore wasn't famous. He wasn't a serial killer. But what made his case unforgettable was not just the crime. It was the haunting question it left behind. What does it do to a man to live 38 years waiting to die? Carey Dean Moore was not born into darkness. He was born into faith. Omaha, Nebraska, mid-1950s. Carey and his identical twin brother, David, were 2 of 7 children in a devout Christian household. Their father was a traveling preacher, often away for long stretches, delivering sermons in rural churches and revival tents. Their mother stayed home, tending to the children, keeping the house quiet, disciplined, God-fearing. The Moore family wasn't wealthy, but they weren't destitute either. What they had was structure, routine, rules, and a deep reliance on Scripture. But under the surface, things weren't as stable as they appeared. Carey struggled in school. Teachers described him as withdrawn, awkward, often staring into space. He never caused trouble in class, but he never seemed to really be present, either. David was the more dominant of the 2, the louder one, the leader. Carey followed. By the time they reached their teens, the twins had started slipping through the cracks. Truancy, petty theft, minor run-ins with the law. Nothing violent. Not yet, but enough to mark them. Enough to suggest that something was veering off course. Some of Carey's siblings would later speak about the emotional volatility between the 2 brothers. Fights that turned physical, intense arguments, then sudden silence, but also long stretches of codependence, where they seemed unable to be apart. For Carey, David wasn't just family, he was a compass. And when that compass spun wild, so did Carey. By his early 20s, Carey had dropped out of school, failed at multiple jobs, and was living a life that could only be described as directionless. There were no long-term plans, no ambitions, just restless days and growing resentment. In July of 1979, something inside him snapped. Carey and David devised a plan, a way to get money fast. They would rob an armored car guard during his routine stop. The logic was simple. The guard would be alone, predictable, vulnerable. On August 22, 1979, Carey Dean Moore walked up to 47-year-old Maynard Helgeland, a World Herald delivery driver, and shot him in cold blood. 5 days later, he did it again. This time, the victim was Ruel Van Ness, Jr., another delivery man. Both men were gunned down without warning. Both killed for less than a few $100s. Carey was arrested shortly after. He confessed. In fact, he insisted on taking full responsibility at trial. He waived his right to a jury. He didn't want appeals, didn't want delays. He told the judge, "I deserve to die." And yet, what followed wasn't swift justice. What followed was 38 years of legal entanglement, political deadlock, shifting death penalty laws, and a man who seemed ready to die but wasn't allowed to. Inside the Nebraska State Penitentiary, Carey Dean Moore became something few expected a fixture, a relic, a living reminder of a system that promised finality but delivered only waiting. He read the Bible, wrote poetry, reflected, cried, denied nothing. The world outside moved on. But for Carey, every year was the same. Steel bars, concrete floors, the hum of fluorescent lights. He once told a reporter, It's not death that scares me. It's the delay. And so we ask again, was this justice, or was this punishment in its cruelest form drawn out? Silent. Endless. Omaha, Nebraska, late 1970s, a city in quiet transition. The factories still hummed. The trains still cut across the skyline. But underneath the rhythm of industry was a growing unease. Economic downturn had left entire neighborhoods hollowed out. Blue-collar families were scraping by. Crime rates had begun to rise. And in the working-class corners of the city, places like North Omaha, where Carey Dean Moore lived, hope was thinning. Carey lived in a small apartment with his brother David, barely getting by. The twins were no longer boys, but they weren't quite men either. They drifted between temporary jobs, loading docks, dishwashing shifts, warehouse gigs, never holding on to anything for long. At night, they stayed up late, talking about money, about escape, about how they were tired of being nobodies. Carey had started reading about prison life, oddly fascinated by the rituals and structure. David, always more impulsive, talked about making a name for himself, about doing something that would force the world to notice them. Neighbors would later recall the two as quiet, polite, but off. Not dangerous. Not exactly, but there was something in their eyes, something hollow. A young woman living downstairs said she often heard them arguing loud, frantic fights followed by eerie silence. Another neighbor said they once asked him about security patterns for delivery trucks. At the time, he thought they were just curious. There were warning signs, a week before the first murder. Carey had pawned his stereo system, something he once considered his most prized possession. Just needed some cash. He told the clerk, but his eyes looked far away, already calculating something bigger. And then there was the gun, a .32 caliber revolver, bought under David's name, but kept in Carey's drawer. He cleaned it every night for a week, meticulously, quietly. August in Omaha was stifling that year. The kind of heat that makes the air thick and time feel heavy. The kind of heat that presses in on a man already living at the edge of himself. On the morning of August 22nd, 1979, Carey woke up early. He didn't eat. He didn't speak much. He just nodded when David asked, "You ready?" Then they walked out into the heat, into a city that wasn't watching, a city that didn't yet know it was about to become the backdrop for two cold-blooded killings. And still no one saw them coming. Because sometimes, evil doesn't shout. Sometimes, it whispers from behind a quiet door, from a life that never made much noise until it exploded. August 22nd, 1979. It was just past 7:00 a.m. when Carey Dean Moore left his apartment. The .32 caliber revolver hidden beneath his shirt, his twin brother, David, followed behind. The streets of Omaha were just waking up, morning papers being tossed onto porches, city buses hissing at curbs, the scent of brewing coffee hanging in the air. But Carey wasn't heading to work. He was heading to kill. Their target that day was Maynard Helgeland, a 47-year-old World Herald circulation driver. Maynard had followed the same route for years, routine, reliable. He would pull up to a collection box, step out, open the back of the van, and begin his deliveries. He was unarmed, alone. At 7:45 a.m., as Helgeland exited his vehicle in a quiet residential area, Carey approached from behind. Witnesses would later recall seeing a man in a cap and dark jacket walking calmly, almost casually. Then, without a word, Carey raised the gun and shot Helgeland in the back of the head. He fell instantly, his glasses landing several feet away. Carey stood over the body for a moment, some say in shock, others say in cold calculation. Then he rifled through the pockets, took a small cash pouch, barely $1,200, and disappeared into the morning light. No chase, no struggle, just a man lying dead on the pavement, and two brothers fading into the city. August 27, 1979, 5 days later. Most killers lay low after murder. Carey and David planned another. Their second victim was Ruel Van Ness Jr., a 47-year-old Omaha courier for Western Electric, another man working an early route, another predictable pattern, another easy kill, this time. The shooting took place in a parking lot outside a shopping center. Carey approached Van Ness as he exited his vehicle. Again. There was no warning, no exchange of words, just 2 quick gunshots, one to the chest, one to the head. This time, there were more witnesses. Shoppers heard the blasts. A woman saw the shooter running. Police arrived within minutes, but the Moores were already gone. What they left behind was confusion, fear, and a trail of recklessness. The arrest, only hours later. A tip came in. A man matching Carey's description had been spotted near the scene. Investigators quickly traced pawnshop records. Carey had recently pawned several items, some for cash, some to fund the escape plan he and David had been haphazardly assembling. But Carey wasn't running. He was waiting. Police arrested him quietly at home that evening. He offered no resistance. When questioned, he confessed immediately, not just to one killing, but to both. He seemed almost relieved. In his official statement, Carey said, "I didn't hate them. I just needed the money. It was easy." He waived his right to an attorney. Then he did something few ever do. He pled guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder and requested the death penalty. Even prosecutors were stunned. This wasn't a man begging for mercy. This was a man who had accepted his fate, or perhaps someone who wanted it. David Moore was never charged. Carey insisted his brother had nothing to do with the murders. Despite growing suspicion from investigators, he shouldered the weight alone and never changed his story. The case should have been over, but it wasn't, because what followed was not the swift justice he demanded, but a Kafkaesque journey through the American legal system that would stretch out for nearly 4 decades. There was no mystery, no hidden gun, no frantic manhunt. Carey Dean Moore solved the case for the detectives the moment he opened his mouth. Within hours of his arrest, he sat in a dimly lit interrogation room and calmly admitted to both murders. No hesitation, no confusion, just facts. "I shot them," he said, "both of them. I wanted the money. I wasn't thinking about anything else." And it was true, he wasn't. The evidence backed up everything he said. Ballistics confirmed that the .32 caliber revolver found under his mattress was the same weapon used in both killings. Gunshot residue matched. Fingerprints were recovered from the second crime scene. The money, what little remained of it, was stashed in a shoebox, barely touched. The autopsy reports on Helgeland and Van Ness were almost identical. Both were shot at close range. Both died instantly. Neither had a chance to react. It wasn't rage, it wasn't personal, it was mechanical, cold, and clean. But what stunned investigators more than the evidence was Carey's demeanor. He spoke without emotion, as if describing something he had watched, not done. When asked about motive, he simply shrugged. "I didn't see another way." Forensic psychologists would later argue that Carey may have exhibited symptoms of antisocial personality disorder detachment, emotional blunting, a lack of empathy, but he was never officially diagnosed. He didn't seem mentally ill. He seemed resigned. When detectives asked if he wanted to plead insanity, he laughed. "I'm not crazy. I just didn't care anymore." Carey Dean Moore refused to cooperate with any effort to spare his life. He rejected the idea of a jury, waived all rights to appeal. He even asked the judge to sentence him as soon as possible, telling the courtroom he didn't deserve leniency. His twin brother, David, sat silently in the back row that day. He never testified, never confessed, and Carey protected him until the end. He didn't pull the trigger. Carey said, "That was me." To the public, the case was open and shut, but in the background, forces were shifting. Nebraska, like many states at the time, was grappling with the growing political and legal complexities surrounding the death penalty. Legal challenges were mounting. Executions were being delayed across the country. And while Carey Moore sat in his cell, fully prepared to die, The system froze. His confession, the damning evidence, even his own willingness to accept death, none of it mattered. Appeals were filed on his behalf, even when he objected. Clergy groups, civil rights attorneys, anti-death penalty activists. They argued he wasn't mentally competent to waive his rights, that no one in their right mind would ask to be executed. And so, Carey Moore waited, through legal challenges, through changes in governors, through drug shortages and court rulings and shifting public opinion. Each time an execution date neared, something intervened, not divine, not dramatic, just bureaucratic stalling. The evidence was ironclad. The killer had confessed, but the minders was punishment. The very thing he asked for remained just out of reach. And so, Carey Dean Moore did something rare. He became a living ghost of the justice system, a man who admitted everything, deserved death by his own words, but was forced to live in the shadow of it. In most death penalty cases, the courtroom is where the fight begins. But for Carey Dean Moore, it was where the fight ended, at least from his perspective. He pled guilty. He waived his right to a jury. He refused to appeal. To the judge. To the lawyers. To the press, he made one thing clear. I committed murder. I'm ready to face the consequences. On December 7, 1979, just 4 months after his arrest, Moore was sentenced to death by a 3-judge panel in Douglas County District Court. The process was swift, clean, clinical, but what came next was anything but. In the years that followed, Carey Dean Moore became one of the first visible faces of a new, uncomfortable category within America's justice system, the volunteer execution inmate. He didn't want clemency. He didn't claim innocence. He didn't want rehabilitation. But in a country increasingly fractured over the death penalty, his certainty made him a legal problem. Over the decades, attorneys filed motions on his behalf without his consent. Civil rights groups challenged his competency. Religious organizations launched petitions, even as Carey continued to write letters from prison asking to accept his sentence. The legal system kept dragging him back into court. In 1995, a federal judge ordered a stay of execution, citing constitutional concerns over Nebraska's use of the electric chair. That delay turned into years. Years turned into decades. And Carey Dean Moore remained caught in the loop, a man who wanted to die, and a system that refused to let him. I'm not fighting this, he wrote in 2001. Why are they? The appeals weren't just about Carey. They were about the system itself, its inconsistencies, its mechanisms of delay, its unwillingness to act even when all sides agree. In 2008, the Nebraska Supreme Court ruled that the electric chair was unconstitutional, citing cruel and unusual punishment. This halted all executions in the state, including Moore's. It would take 10 more years before the state resolved the legal and logistical issues involved in transitioning to lethal injection. But when the drugs were finally obtained through a controversial and secretive process, Carey Dean Moore was at the top of the list. By then, he had been on death row for 38 years, making him the longest-serving death row inmate in Nebraska history. He had filed no appeals of his own in over 2 decades, and when asked if he still accepted the sentence, yes, he said, I was guilty then. I'm guilty now. The system has kept me alive far longer than I ever expected. As his new execution date approached in 2018, the debate reignited. Supporters of the death penalty saw Moore's case as proof the system worked too slowly. Opponents saw it as evidence that capital punishment had become cruel by delay. The controversy wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about evidence. It wasn't even about fairness anymore. It was about something deeper. What happens when a man pleads guilty to murder and asks to die, but the system simply can't? And so the final ruling wasn't just a judgment against Carey Dean Moore. It was a verdict on Nebraska itself. August 13, 2018. A Monday, hot, still, quiet, inside the Nebraska State Penitentiary. Carey Dean Moore woke up for the last time. He had known this day was coming for 38 years. He had watched cellmates come and go, executions scheduled and stayed, laws passed and overturned. He had grown old inside those concrete walls. And now, finally, it was his turn. There were no cries of injustice, no last-minute pleas, no media circus. Carey had asked for no visitors, save one, a spiritual advisor, a man of faith who had been meeting with him regularly for years. He spent most of the morning in prayer. The prison officials noted that Moore was calm, polite, cooperative. There were no outbursts, no pacing, just a quiet man who had spent half his life preparing for a death that had taken this long to arrive. The last meal. Nebraska does not offer elaborate last meal requests. Instead, inmates receive a standard prison meal. Carey ate it without comment. Menu records show he received scrambled eggs, toast with jelly, fruit cup, and coffee. Simple. Forgettable. But fitting for a man who had spent his final years shrinking from the spotlight. The final hours. That afternoon, Carey wrote a final letter not to the court, not to the media, but to the families of his victims. It wasn't a grand gesture. It wasn't an apology drenched in drama. I can never undo what I did. He wrote, but I hope that someday you find peace, even if I never deserve it. He didn't speak of himself, didn't ask for forgiveness. He just signed his name. And then, he waited. By 5:00 p.m., prison officials began final preparations. Moore was moved to the holding area adjacent to the execution chamber. He was allowed a final visit with his spiritual advisor. They prayed together, read from the Bible. At 9:15 p.m., he was asked if he had any last words. Carey Dean Moore paused, then said quietly, God has forgiven me. I hope you will, too. No theatrics, no final cries, no drama. Just a man facing what he had always accepted. One guard, speaking anonymously after the execution, said it was like he was ready, like he'd already died a long time ago, and today was just catching up. For Carey Dean Moore, death had never been the punishment. Waiting had been, and now, that wait was over. August 14, 2018, 10:00 a.m. The door to the execution chamber opened. Carey Dean Moore walked in slowly, guided by two officers, his wrists loosely restrained. He wasn't dragged. He didn't resist. There was no struggle. He looked resigned, composed, almost as though he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. The chamber was cold, stark, lit with fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. On one side of the glass, prison officials, on the other, witnesses, journalists, attorneys, and members of the victims' families. No one spoke. Carey lay down on the padded gurney. Straps were secured over his arms, chest, and legs. His breathing remained steady. A microphone was lowered toward his face for any final statement. He raised his head slightly and said, I'm sorry. I tried to become a better man. I hope God accepts me. Then he closed his eyes. The lethal injection. Nebraska was using lethal injection for the first time in state history. The drug cocktail included 4 substances: diazepam sedative, fentanyl citrate, a powerful opioid, tizatrecurium bisylate to paralyze, potassium chloride to stop the heart. The IV line had been inserted into his right arm. At 10:24 a.m., the first drug began to flow. Carey's chest rose and fell. His mouth moved slightly, whispering what appeared to be a prayer. His lips formed the words, Jesus, forgive me. Within moments, his body went still. His eyelids twitched once. Then nothing. A prison doctor stepped forward, checked his vitals. No pulse, no breath. At 10:47 a.m., Carey Dean Moore was pronounced dead. The room stayed silent. There was no applause, no cheers, just silence. Some witnesses wiped away tears, not for Moore, but perhaps for the weight of the moment, for the years lost, for the families sitting across from them who had waited decades for this day. The room emptied slowly. No one spoke much. Outside, The world continued like it always had. Cars passed, birds flew overhead, and life moved on. But inside those walls, something had ended. Not just a life, but a story that had lasted nearly 40 years. When Carey Dean Moore died, very little changed. The headlines ran for a day. The first execution in Nebraska in 21 years, the first by lethal injection. The end of the state's longest-serving death row inmate. But by the following week, his name had already begun to fade from public memory. Yet for some, the story lingered not because of what he did, but because of what he became. Here was a man who confessed without excuse, who asked to be executed, and who waited nearly 4 decades for a sentence that had already been agreed upon. Supporters of the death penalty called the case a victory delayed, but deserved, to them. Carey Moore represented accountability, even if the system was slow to deliver it. But critics saw something else. They saw a man stripped of all fight, held in a concrete purgatory for most of his life, not to be reformed, not to be freed, but to simply wait, to breathe in a cage, year after year, until the paperwork caught up with the bullet he fired 4 decades before. Was that justice, or was it a punishment beyond death? His victims' families expressed mixed feelings. Relief, yes, closure, maybe, but no celebration, because nothing could bring back Maynard Helgeland or Reuel Van Ness, Jr. Their stories ended the moment Carey pulled the trigger. His, somehow, kept going. And so now we ask, if a man admits his guilt, rejects mercy, and waits 38 years to die, is the state delivering justice, or avoiding it? Should the legal system protect those who no longer want to be protected? And what do we make of a death penalty that punishes by forcing someone to live? Carey Dean Moore never begged for life. He didn't scream for forgiveness. He just waited. And then he was gone. And in his absence, only one question remains. Did the system kill a man? Or did it just outlive him?